Thanks very much. So I'm going to speak a little bit about an initiative that I introduced a number of years ago now, but as it says, I introduced podcasts as a form of inclusive assessment back in 2020, so about 4 years ago. And over the last number of years now, this has evolved as a result of student input, student feedback. So I'll take you through the assessment itself and what we've done, I suppose, and the learning outcomes for the students and various different things along that line. This is a diverse class. I'm in the Department of Geography, and I teach this as a module. I teach within urban and social geography specifically, and I teach a class on global urbanism, which is around sustainable cities and communities. And so this is a third year or a final year undergraduate module in geography in Cork, but it's taken by a very diverse class. So I have students who are BA students, I have students who are in the BSc, Public Health. I have students as well who are visiting students. About 15% of the class is usually about visiting students, so we've got them from right around the world, not just EU. And then also I have students in the class who are part of the Certificate in Social Citizenship. And for anyone that's aware, this module, I'm a teaching fellow on the ID Plus project in UCC, which is a transformative project of inclusive education specifically, and it provides inclusive education options for students with intellectual disabilities. So I have students from, as I say, the Certificate in Social Citizenship with ID who join and co-learn with other students in this geography module. So it's a very diverse and a very varied class in particular. It's usually, I don't know if I said this, sorry, but it's usually about 120 or 130 students are registered in total. So it's also a very large class, and as anyone knows, in those contexts that presents itself a whole series of challenges within those contexts as well. So I'll talk about it a little bit more. But this assessment, this assessment was designed following the principles of UDL. I did UDL badge with my colleague Laura here from UCC a number of years ago, and so UDL has been part of my practice now for many years. But I designed this according to UDL principles, especially around multiple means of representation, so the ability to represent learning and knowledge differently, but also as well around multiple modes of action and expression, so again, the ability to express oneself in a slightly different way. The motivation, of course, with this was to improve inclusion of all learners within the classroom, as well as diversify the assessment format to not only something that might be different and creative, but move us away from some of the traditional written assessments that very much, as we all know, still dominate assessment in higher education today. So the students produce, as I say, an informed podcast episode, which is based on their own independent research into the themes and content of the module, which is of their choosing effectively. It's an active learning method, primarily where the students learn by doing, and they learn by actively creating their own knowledge on the subject areas, again, whichever subject areas they're interested in. The students communicate their findings then in a very conversational manner through a conversational format, and it's to a diverse audience. It's an imaginary audience, but it's a diverse audience in many ways, building skills primarily in the accessible communication of knowledge, and in our case of geographic or scientific knowledge. So the students are provided with very clear and very detailed guidelines on a range of aspects of this assessment, just basically to provide them with the information that's required, because as we know, sometimes with these new assessments, there can be that hesitation. And so having a detailed set of information is really very critical, I think, to the success of the assessment as a whole. Another thing that was very important was the choice, I'm not even on the right slide, sorry, no? So the big green button, now this way. No? There. So one of the things that was integral, they're not integral, they're available as Dara said. Choice was a really kind of integral part, I think, of the design and of the success of this assessment in particular. So the students choose the topics and the themes and the case studies for their research, and they're encouraged to do research on topics that are of interest to them. So encouraging that kind of intrinsic motivation that is really critical as part of deep learning and these kinds of things. It makes the assessment obviously much more meaningful for the students, and they generally speaking then perform better. They're also provided with choice in how they work, so they can work individually or they can work collaboratively on this particular project. So in this current academic year, half the class, so I had about 60 students that worked with others and collaborated in small groups, and about 60 students that decided to work independently. for the assessment to help the students make an informed decision about how they might work and whether or not they might work with others. They're provided with detailed guidelines about the two different types of assessment, so about the criteria for groups and how they might come together and all those different, the time limits, the different themes, the content, various different things that they might have to do. I also then articulate the benefits, I have a discussion with them and articulate the benefits of individual and peer learning or collaborative learning as opposed to group work, shift the kind of the understandings around that, I think, away from group work, which has a lot of negative connotations attached to it, to thinking about peer learning as this environment where we kind of come together in a more collaborative sense and we bring together a whole range of various different skills and can work with others and develop our own skills. So this allows then the students to make an informed choice about whether or not they're working with others or working kind of independently. So then students produce a reflective learning statement then. So thinking about the impacts of this, students produce a reflective learning statement at the end of the module, and they reflect back on not just what they have learnt in terms of the actual content, but actually how they have learnt. And it's the how that is a very critical part, as others have said, in understanding whether or not these assessments have been successful. But this is part of also the UDL principles of developing expert learners, where the students understand not just what they're learning, but how they're learning. So choice was critical for the students in their feedback, independent research, and the oral and oral mode of delivery was also a really critical element, and these are things that offer the deepest learning. So each year students remark on the benefits of that oral and oral assessment, in particular whereby they're actively listening to what's being said as part of their delivery, together with speaking their ideas or their knowledge out loud, and that results in the deeper learning and the greater retention of knowledge for them in particular. They also reflect on, obviously, the benefits of the podcast for building their oral presentation skills, and the asynchronous delivery of a podcast then also allows them to focus on developing those communication skills, but in a less pressurized format for them in particular. So they're still developing that. The reflective statements then also, the use of those is really important as well. It generates their knowledge about, for the students themselves, it generates their knowledge about themselves as learners, and it then can be transferred, of course, to other contexts like their workplaces, beyond and things like that. The collaborative peer learning that some of the students opt for allows for inclusion, very much so, of the diverse learning styles, and it's through the module that the students, and this is an example here, the students with intellectual disabilities work collaboratively with other students in the module on their coursework, both their coursework and their assessment. And because UDL, as I said earlier, has been part of my practice for many years now, the students with intellectual disabilities engage with the module and the assessment just like all the other students do. I've not had to create separate assessments. The students work in a group with others and they all collaborate then on their co-learning activities. And this avoids the provision of separate or segregated assessments or learning spaces within, and by obviously attempting to design something for all students then from the outset. But just in terms of impact then again, as someone said before, there's a really big impact between the assessment and inclusive assessment, but an inclusive module more broadly, and that the two kind of have to obviously go together. So the impacts of inclusivity in both learning and assessment are highly valued, and one student in particular recognised this, and this was a visiting student who says, really thankful for inclusive aspects of the course. I've never experienced anything like this at the home university. I found my teachers were on the most part receptive to my needs as a student with a learning disability, but I've never experienced a class where the overall structure was meant for all learning styles. And because of this, the class was far less daunting and easier to become interested in because I knew all varieties of people had a place within it. So I think when we create these modules, from the outset with a holistic kind of view of inclusivity, not just the assessment, but the entire module, then we can see these strong kind of outcomes and learning outcomes in particular. So very quickly then, just in terms of thinking about what I suppose makes this successful in a number of ways, or meaningful actually, more so, rather than successful, is meaningful, I think, to the students, is that it's a structured assessment task. I think with very clear and detailed guidelines is really very critical. It's also really critical from our perspective because of the size of the class and inquiries and these kinds of things. The use of the oral and the oral method of delivery is also really important. The independent research and the new knowledge that gets constructed, that the students are active in that process. The high degree of choice and the creativity, again, for that kind of intrinsic motivation, and having those options available for peer collaboration so that they can learn with and from others, which is also really very important. The development of new skills as well was really important, especially in that diverse communication of knowledge, which is a really critical skill, obviously, for the world that we're living in today, but not one that is perhaps, forefront of some of the things that the skills we might be developing. So the podcast assessment really is inclusive then, I suppose, of a range of diverse learners and learning styles, but having made a number of sort of sustained investments in inclusive assessment, the students are also performing at their best and in a way that brings out their best in particular. So year on year, there has been a notable improvement in student performance in particular within this module and this cohort. The podcasts offer an effective way of seeing what students have learnt over the course of a semester, and also seeing how that learning can come to life in different ways. And there's also been a notable decrease then, obviously, in individual accommodations within the module as a result of all these changes. So on that note, I will end. So thank you very much.
That was so interesting, and one of the things I really enjoyed about that is that as an organisation that's promoting UDL, working alongside our colleagues in UCD to run the badge, for example, one of the things that we come up against is that sort of dauntingness about introducing choice, about particularly in the assessment phase. But actually, choices can be quite small to begin with. That we can iterative. So the really good example there of the choice to do something as an individual or as a group, even a small change like that, is actually quite powerful.